Good day. Rumours are rife as of last night and this morning that Ukraine might be on the eve of launching its much debated and discussed counteroffensive, principally focused upon the south of Ukraine. This despite the fact that, according to Russian estimates, Ukraine has only received around 20% of the tanks which it was promised by the West, and of course the number of tanks the West promised is also far short of the number of tanks that Ukraine itself said it needed in order to carry out a successful offensive, be it in the south or indeed anywhere else in Ukraine as well. But putting all that aside, and as of this moment in time, there's little actual concrete information about any Ukrainian counterattack. Fighting continues in other places. Now, yesterday I reported the fact that the Russians, Yevgeny Prigozhin to be precise, was saying that the Russians had captured the central administration building in Bakhmut and raised their flag there, a flag which referenced Vladlen Tatarsky, the Russian war reporter who was murdered in St. Petersburg the other day. Well, we've now had conclusive confirmation of this. There's been photographs which show this building with the Russian flag on it. There's no doubt at all that it has been captured. They also show the building in a state of extreme ruins. It has clearly been heavily devastated by intense fighting and typical, by the way, of most of the situation of Bakhmut itself. But there's no doubt at all that the Russians are still largely, are now largely or fully in control of central Bakhmut. In fact, I read a report earlier today, which from a Russian channel, which claimed that the Russians now control 85% of Bakhmut, and apparently they continue to make significant advances in the fighting in Bakhmut over the course of the last 24 hours. And this report went on to say that the Ukrainian resistance in Bakhmut, though it continues to be fierce, is starting to weaken, that it is in fact Ukrainian defences which are starting to crumble rather than the Russians who are losing momentum, as some earlier reports in the West were suggesting. You want to find this report, whose origin I don't know. You can find it on the Slavyangrad Telegram channel, which, as well as being, in my opinion, one of the single most reliable place to find a detailed account of the fighting, also acts as a very effective site aggregator, bringing together reports from both sides of the conflict, Ukrainian as well, by the way. Whilst I'm on the topic of Slavyangrad, I noticed a rather interesting article by Andrew Roth in The Guardian discussing the murder of Vladlen Tatarsky, mentioning that he belongs to an ecosystem of, or belonged to an ecosystem of various Russian military bloggers and Telegram channels, conceding that these channels were, in many cases, very critical of the Russian authorities, but perhaps inevitably rather casting doubt on their reliability. I have to say that these channels, both Russian and Ukrainian, in my opinion, despite what Andrew Roth says, are by far the most reliable source of the actual battle, of what's actually going on in these battles. You have to take always the openly expressed biases into account, but they do have informants and reporters on the ground. Many of the people who are involved in preparing these channels also have military backgrounds themselves, and in any event, they're much closer to the events than reporters writing about fighting in Kiev or Moscow, let alone London, Washington, New York, Paris, Berlin, or wherever. And I think anybody who tries to understand what's going on in this war without referencing these people and reading what they say is going to get the fighting completely and profoundly wrong. They will not understand what is going on any particular day, or indeed over the course of the war as a whole. So that's just my view. Andrew Roth clearly has his, but I think it's just as well that I set out my own view on this particular issue, because as you will have noticed, I do rely on these Telegram channels quite a lot when I discuss the state of the fighting in my programs. Anyway, regardless of that, clear evidence that the Russians are indeed making progress. And in Bakhmut, and we've also had some confirmation of this from Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk regional government. He's given another interview on Russian television. He seems to be on Russian television practically every day. But anyway, he says this. Artyomov's direction, Artyomovsk, to reiterate again, is the Russian name for Bakhmut. Right now, Russian forces have almost come almost right next to the railway station. The enemy, he means the Ukrainians, is forced to retreat to the previously prepared positions in the western part of the city. And Pushilin is then reported to have said that the fighting is very intense and is going on in downtown Artyomovsk, Bakhmut. And according to Pushilin, Russian forces are engaged in an almost constant offensive and have taken the roads leading into the city. These are the two roads that pass through Kholmovo, slightly to the north, and Ivanivska, slightly to the south, under even tighter fire control. And in fact, there have also been reports that even as the Russians push the Ukrainians hard in Bakhmut itself, they're continuing to apply pressure on Ukrainian forces that are defending themselves in these two villages. Now, I've discussed many times my difficulties reading maps, but I understand that the railway station is located firmly in the western part of Bakhmut. So if it is indeed the case that the Russians, that the Wagner forces are close to the railway station, then it is highly likely that they are indeed advancing at the pace, at the rate that Pushilin and others say, and that they do indeed control 85% of the town. I would say that I am confident, however, that the Ukrainians are still in control of the Avant-Garde Stadium. I understand that the Russians are very close to it. They've basically perhaps surrounded it, but the Ukrainians are still in control of the stadium itself, and that remains an important fortified position. Now, there's also been some reports from Andreevka, and again we come to Denis Pushilin talking in the same television interview. He says that in the Andreevka direction, our units are also moving forward. It is early to speak about operational encirclement. Yet, the situation emerging for the enemy is extremely difficult, if not critical. Here we see the need to blockade the road, which is being done quite successfully. And Pushilin went on to say that Russian troops are developing their offensive in the Avdiivka area after what he referred to as the liberation of Krasnogorovka, this important village to the north of Avdiivka, which the Russians captured about 2 weeks ago. So that's what Pushilin says about the fighting in Avdiivka. Now, all of that, to some extent, as of today, continues, however, to be overshadowed by the rumours that this Ukrainian offensive is about to begin. I have to say that given the weather conditions, what I've heard about the weather conditions, I find that a little surprising, but who knows? Anyway, what is indisputable is that there's been a great deal of shelling across the battle lines in the south of Ukraine. The Russians seem to be launching particularly heavy artillery and airstrikes on Ukrainian forces gathered around Orekhov, which is this town in Zaporozhye region, which the Russians approached in January but never seem to have attempted to storm, and which they appear to believe is which will form the anchor of the Ukrainian advance. I'm now coming round to the view, by the way, that the Russian advance in Zaporozhye region in January was not intended to be a general offensive. It was intended to bring Russian forces within striking distance of Orekhov in the knowledge that this was going to be the main area of concentration of Ukrainian troops, and that has enabled the Russians to conduct artillery strikes on Ukrainian positions and concentrations of Ukrainian troops in Orekhov, and to do them, according to the Russians, of course, with some success. Of course, what the Ukrainians themselves say about these artillery strikes, these Russian artillery strikes, well, that I don't know. I don't think actually that they discuss them very much. Anyway, another of our various commenters, Vladimir Rogov, the head of the, one of the officials of the Zaporozhye regional government set up by the Russians in the part of Zaporozhye region which they control, has now been discussing the situation with TASS, or the Russian TASS news agency. And this, he is doing this in connection with Ukrainian artillery strikes on Melitopol, and there's been a number of strikes on Melitopol, and also some sort of, you might call them sabotage or bomb attacks in Melitopol. Ukraine has inserted some infiltrators there. There was a bomb attack on the car of a regional official in Melitopol, Russian regional official in Melitopol, who's severely injured, but apparently not yet killed. At least he's still alive. Anyway, there's been things like that going on. And I understand that most, in fact all of the shelling of Melitopol, which is principally being conducted by HIMARS missiles, is taking place from the area of Orekhov. And this is how Rogov talks about it. He says that attacks on Melitopol have intensified as Ukrainian forces are testing the ground for an offensive. And Rogov is quoted by TASS as saying that the Ukrainian military could launch a counterattack at any time, and it is the Zaporozhye front that will be the priority for them. And he has also apparently told TASS that he thinks that Ukraine might also try to launch waterborne attacks. That could be an attempt to try to cross the Dnieper River into Kherson region. There was a report yesterday, false as it turned out, that from Ukrainian sources that the Russians had abandoned their positions in a particular settlement on the east bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson region. Anyway, that could all be an attempt to play mind games with the Russians preparatory to some sort of amphibious assault across the Dnieper into Kherson region, the eastern part of Kherson region, in conjunction with this offensive, which the Ukrainians are said to be planning in Zaporozhye region. Anyway, a lot of discussion, some shelling by both sides. I will say that there have been some HIMARS missile strikes on Melitopol, but my impression is that they've been of relatively low intensity. There have not been many HIMARS missiles, and the Russians seem to feel that they're able to intercept most of these HIMARS missile strikes. Now, in a recent program, Brian Belletti at the New Atlas pointed out that the extent of Ukrainian HIMARS missile strikes appears to have declined markedly in recent months, and which is true. And he also suggested that the probable reason that, well, one possible reason why that might be the case is that Ukraine has lost most of its HIMARS launchers. The Russians have been claiming at various times that they've tracked down and destroyed HIMARS launchers. The US and Ukraine have generally denied that. They've never admitted to the loss of a single launcher. In fact, I have no doubt that some of the launchers have indeed been destroyed, and it could be that the reason we're seeing fewer of these missile strikes with HIMARS missiles taking place is precisely because Ukraine does indeed have fewer launchers for these missiles. I would say, however, that there is another possibility, which is that Ukraine might be stockpiling HIMARS missiles in advance of its offensive. And we might start to see a lot more of these missiles being used once the offensive does indeed get underway. I would say, however, something else about the HIMARS system. When it started to be used by Ukraine last summer, it was a system that the Russians had very little information about, advanced information about. Obviously, they knew of its existence. They had some general ideas of its general parameters. But that is not the same as having to confront and deal with the system in actual combat conditions. So the Russians, for a time, did have problems with the HIMARS missile system. Over the course of the last few months, the Russians, however, will have gained a great deal of information about the HIMARS system indeed. Now, this will have come partly from the capture of intact missiles, which has happened. I've actually seen pictures of intact HIMARS missiles in Russian possession, and the Russians have obviously examined these missiles and got a clearer idea of how they work and what they can do. So there's been some of that, but of course the very act of having to conduct military operations in the face of HIMARS missile strikes is something which will have affected the way in which the Russians operate. And, of course, over the last 10 months or so, the Russians will have worked out countermeasures. And, in fact, they have indeed worked out quite a lot of countermeasures. Even Western commentators are talking about how the Russians have learned to disperse their depots and their barracks so that they're not so vulnerable to HIMARS strikes. And, of course, the Russians, as they said themselves, have updated the software of their air defense systems and are much better able to shoot down HIMARS missiles than they were back in the summer and autumn. So, yes, this remains an effective system, and the Ukrainians may have more of a punch than perhaps people realize with respect to this system. but the Russians are better prepared for it, understand it better than they did back in the autumn when the previous Ukrainian offensive took place. So, just making that general observation. Now, I don't know much about the various plans that are going on, which the two sides are making. When Shoigu visited the Russian headquarters in Rostov-on-Don a few days ago, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that the Russian military does indeed have a plan. So, you know, there are plans, and we can see some of the things that the Russians are doing. They continue to build enormous fortifications across this entire region, in Zaporozhye region, in Kherson region, in Crimea itself, long layers of defense lines, which are on a scale that we've not seen before in this conflict. I suspect they go far beyond the scale, even of the fortifications that Ukraine created in Donbass, though of course I don't know that for a fact. Anyway, there's been an enormous amount of fortifying by the Russians since October, and undoubtedly the Russians have brought up their forces in in this area, this battle area along the Black Sea up to strength, and they've been launching more, as I said, artillery strikes, and they also launched a very significant cruise and drone strike on Ukrainian positions in southern Ukraine yesterday, particularly again targeting the Odessa area. And there's been some suggestions that a larger proportion of uranium-2 drones were able to reach their targets in Odessa than before, and there's some speculations on the Russian side that this is because the Ukrainian air defense system has now been depleted to the point where, in order to provide effective air defense for Kiev itself, air defense assets across Ukraine, including in the Odessa area, have had to be transferred to bolster the air defenses in Kiev. Now, I say that's of course a Russian claim that more of these drones are getting through, these uranium-2 drones are getting through. The Ukrainians, on the contrary, claim that they were rather successful shooting down uranium-2 drones in Odessa. What I will say about all of that is that it took a while for Ukraine to admit the missile and drone strikes on Odessa. There's apparently some delays in sounding the alarm that this strike was indeed underway. And again, that may imply that the drone strikes were indeed fairly successful, in the sense that more drones did indeed penetrate, as the Russians claim. But let me repeat once more, I am not reporting the situation from the ground. It's not always easy to tell who's telling the truth, given the competing narratives. I can only report what people say and inform you of my own judgments. Now, having said that, that does bring us to a number of commentaries that there have been about the state of the war in the Western media. There was a report in the New York Times about the fact that the Ukrainian army is becoming tired. There was a similar report in the Washington Post. I'm not going to devote much time to those articles. There was also an article by Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times. Gideon Rachman, who is a strong supporter of Ukraine, has visited Ukraine, and specifically Kiev, and though he tries hard in this article to be optimistic, my overall impression was that he also felt that there's been a lowering of morale, a decline of morale in Ukraine, that people are tired and exhausted, and that there's a sense that altogether too much is now riding on this Ukrainian counteroffensive. In fact, Gideon Rachman actually says at one point that some Ukrainian officials are worried that if the offensive fails or doesn't achieve its objectives, people in the West should not jump to conclusions that Ukraine is indeed losing the war. And I find that an interesting comment because it sort of suggests that there is not very high optimism in Kiev about this offensive's prospects. But anyway, all of these articles, to my mind, come together in a much more interesting article. In The Hill is one of those US publications which cover principally US domestic politics. Its closest British equivalent, it seems to me, is The Spectator. It's one of those magazines that, as it covers a lot of politics. The Hill, presumably, is Capitol Hill, but it also does talk about foreign policy quite a lot. And this article is by Earl Mack, who is a former US diplomat. He was ambassador to Finland, I understand, at one time. And he says this, and this article dates from the 29th of March, so it's just a few days old. As fatigue grows and morale wanes in Ukraine, defeat is a real possibility. And the article then goes on to say this, and I'm going to quote from it extensively. The Russian invasion of Ukraine recently passed the one-year mark, and I fear the country is on the verge of losing to Russia. As someone who has visited Ukraine multiple times on humanitarian missions, my last trip convinced me that the country is at a pivotal moment. Morale is slipping. I could see it in the eyes of the children. More importantly, I could hear it in the voice of their leaders, who continue to say all the right things, but lack the same conviction as before. The United States, NATO, and our European allies have been propping up Ukraine to fight a proxy war. It's interesting, by the way, that he says that Ukraine is fighting a proxy war. But anyway, I will move on. But the efforts amount to doing half a job. The failure of the United States and NATO to provide the necessary support, including modern military equipment, is a major issue. It seems the majority of the equipment being supplied to the Ukrainians came out of a Cold War era military museum. Ukrainian soldiers are fighting the Russians with Leopard tanks, only a handful of which are modern, and Soviet-era MiG fighters that are over 30 years old. By the time US Abrams tanks reach Ukraine in 8 to 10 months, as US officials have stated, the war could well be over. We need to send the Ukrainians modern fighting hardware yesterday. Where is the urgency? Now, I'm going to say a few things about this. First of all, as is fairly clear, Earl Mack is a supporter of Ukraine. He wants Ukraine to win. We're going to come to that further in the programme. But he's talking about falling morale in Ukraine, including amongst Ukraine's own leaders. They no longer have the conviction in victory that they did previously. And this is connected to disappointment about the dwindling, the lack of advanced military equipment they're getting from the West. And note how Mack says that the Leopard tanks, only a handful of them are modern. And this clearly derives from the Ukrainian military's own assessment of these tanks. They've now received quite a few of these tanks, about 50 of them, I believe, in total. They come from various different sources. And of course, the Leopard 2 tank has had an extensive construction history, and these tanks come from different batches. And it seems that the Ukrainians have found that only a handful of these Leopard 2 tanks, are fully up to date. Now, I say Leopard 2 tanks because, as far as I'm aware, Ukraine has not yet received any of the much older Leopard 1 tanks that, as I said, date principally from the 1960s and 1970s. So already there is disappointment with the quality of both with the quality and the quantity of the supplies of equipment that Ukraine has received from the West. And then Mack goes on to say, well, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is just a year old. The nation has been in almost continual conflict since 2014. A fact, by the way, which the Russians also make, but which people in the West don't want to acknowledge. In fact, I can remember Boris Johnson, before the fighting taking off in February last year, actually calling Ukraine a peaceful country, which of course it was not. It has not known peace since 2014. And Mack describes this as a case when Russian-backed separatist movements in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine declared independence, and the Russian government annexed the Crimean Peninsula. And then he goes on to say, as the Ukrainians approach a decade of death and chaos, President Putin knows that the Russians will win a war of attrition. It's a point that has been made by Brian Beletic, by Scott Ritter, by Douglas McGregor, time and again. And here we have a senior US diplomat who knows Ukraine well. He's just been to Ukraine. He's had meetings with Ukrainian leaders, and they are admitting to him that Ukraine is in a war of attrition, and that they know that they are losing, that this is a war of attrition, that Russia is winning and knows that it is winning. And then Mack goes on to say this: Ukrainian cities are systematically being pounded into rubble, critical infrastructure totally destroyed or rendered inoperable. Over 10 million Ukrainians have crossed the border or fled their country. The loss of population, death and destruction has left the people, especially its children, emotionally devastated. Time is one commodity the Ukrainians don't have. Ukraine isn't just losing its present and past, it is losing its future too. In a war that has often seen Ukrainian parents sent off to battle, it is children that are left vulnerable. According to the United States Embassy in Italy, about 25% of Ukrainian armed forces are female, 60,000 in regular positions, 5,000 on the front lines. And then he talks about how Putin has exploited this dire situation by deporting more than 10,000 Ukrainian children back to Russia. Well, that's Mack's view. I'm not going to explore that. And he talks about Putin's war crimes and compares those to the Nazis in the Second World War, which I don't accept at all. But anyway, he goes on to say that the situation is not only a tragedy for the children and their families, but also for Ukraine's future. Children are the future of any country, and Ukraine is losing a significant part of its future. Who will rebuild Ukraine after the war is over? And about that, by the way, I am in complete agreement. But then, of course, we find ourselves in the absurd situation. Rather, the absurd analysis. At least I find it absurd. I don't find it just absurd. I find it wrong, because you would have thought that Mr. Mack, assessing all of these things, would conclude that what Ukraine most needs is peace, not more war, and that the way to do that is to achieve some kind of diplomatic, political settlement in Ukraine. But instead of that, he does exactly what all of those participants in that meeting discussed by Spengler in Asia Times, which I discussed about a week ago. And by the way, several people have written to me informing me of who Spengler is. He's a gentleman, a Mr. Goldman, a former banker and a well-known personality in the United States, somebody who is, in all respects, the kind of person you would expect to attend these kind of meetings. And I accept that he's no longer keeping his identity secret, even though he does still like to use the name Spengler for his articles in Asia Times. But anyway, putting that aside, Spengler described a situation where, in spite of the recognition that Ukraine is losing the war and that the United States might have no means of turning things round, he described a situation in which the only response of US officials was to try to find ways to escalate and double down. And so he dismisses any possibility of the Chinese fulfilling any kind of mediation role. He says China's intervention in the conflict in any form will help buoy Russian resolve and rearm. And he says that whilst our efforts to arm the Ukrainians are taking the slow boat to China, Xi Jinping has taken a rocket ship to Russia. How I detest these kind of clever verbal gymnastics. What does that even mean, actually? I mean, it's not as if the United States hasn't provided tens of billions of dollars of military equipment to Ukraine. But anyway, and, you know, what has China done in response to that? But anyway, so don't negotiate, don't even think about negotiating. Provide Ukraine with more arms and do it immediately. Do it as a matter of urgency so that Ukraine's counteroffensive, this counteroffensive I was talking about at the start of this program, this counteroffensive which, for all we know, might be about to start. It might have already started by the time you're watching this program, so that this counteroffensive can succeed. There is a ray of hope. Ukraine has been preparing a counteroffensive that could change the course of the war and lay the groundwork for a settlement. After the prolonged battle for Bakhmut, Russian forces were considerably weakened. Where's the evidence of this? I'm not going to discuss this anymore. It's become now a mantra amongst those people who want to see the war continue